Imagine opening a history book and finding nothing. Entire dynasties erased. Philosophers who never existed. Questions you're not allowed to ask. Over 2,000 years ago, China's first emperor tried exactly that. He didn't just conquer armies, he tried to conquer memory itself. This is the story of Qin Shi Huang, the man who unified China and then ordered the past to burn. But here's the mystery. If he really destroyed the old ideas, how do we know so much about them today? Because history did something he couldn't control. It remembered. Official chronicles tell us he burned books and buried scholars. Yet archaeological finds and careful texts hint at exaggeration, propaganda, and political spin written long after he died. So which is it? Was Qin Shi Huang a monster of censorship or a victim of hostile historians? And what really happened the year he tried to edit reality? To answer that, we have to go back to a China that didn't yet exist. For centuries before Qin Shi Huang, China wasn't one country. It was a brutal arena called the Warring States period. From the 5th to 3rd century BCE, rival states like Qin, Chu, Qi, Zhao, and Han fought for survival. Armies in the hundreds of thousands clashed. Cities were annihilated. Kings rose and fell in rapid succession. But amidst this chaos, something extraordinary happened. Instead of one dominant ideology, China became a marketplace of ideas. And that would later terrify Qin Shi Huang. This era produced what later generations called the 100 Schools of Thought. Confucians preached virtue and ritual. Mohists argued for universal love and meritocracy. Taoists whispered about effortless harmony with the cosmos. Legalists calculated power with cold precision. Teachers traveled from court to court, selling ideas the way mercenaries sold swords. Rulers hired philosophers to legitimize their reigns or to design systems of control. In this intellectual free-for-all, thought was a weapon, and one small, rugged Western state learned how to sharpen it best: Qin. Qin began as a frontier state in the West, near today's Shanxi. Long dismissed by Eastern elites as rough and uncivilized, Qin hardened itself through war and reform. In the 4th century BCE, a legalist thinker named Shang Yang transformed Qin into a ruthless war machine. Strict laws, collective punishment, standardized ranks, and land for soldiers who brought back enemy heads. Most states had philosophers. Qin had a system, but the philosophy that powered Qin's rise was anything but gentle. Legalism, fa jia, was not about harmony or virtue. It was about results. Thinkers like Shang Yang, Han Fei, and Li Si believed people respond to rewards and punishments, not moral lectures. So they proposed clear laws, severe penalties, and absolute authority for the ruler. Tradition? Suspicious. Private loyalties? Dangerous. Independent thinkers? Potential traitors. Under legalism, the state became a machine, and humans its replaceable parts. This was the intellectual operating system that Qin Shi Huang would inherit, and pushed to terrifying extremes. But here's the twist. Qin didn't exist in an intellectual vacuum. Confucianism argued rulers should lead by moral example, following ancient rites and texts, especially the odes and documents. Mohism condemned lavish wars. Taoism questioned rigid control altogether. To Confucians, history was a moral mirror. You studied the past to judge the present. To legalists, that was a problem. If officials constantly compared you to legendary sage kings, your authority was never safe. This tension between past and present would explode once Qin finally unified China. In 259 BCE, in the state of Qin, a boy named Ying Zheng was born. By 13, he was king. By his 20s, he'd survived court intrigues, regency struggles, and attempted coups. Guided by legalist ministers like Li Si, he rebuilt control over the court, then turned outward. Over 2 decades, Qin armies crushed the other 6 major states: Han, Zhao, Wei, Chu, Yan, and Qi. By 221 BCE, for the first time in history, most of what we now call China was under a single ruler. The conquest was brutal. Qin generals like Wang Jian annihilated enemy armies, sometimes executing surrendered soldiers en masse. Cities were relocated, nobles deported, populations resettled. But victory wasn't the end of Qin's ambitions. It was the beginning. In 221 BCE, Yingzheng took a new title, Shi Huangdi, the first August emperor. He wasn't just another king. He claimed to start an entirely new era. And to make that claim stick, he had to do more than control land. He had to control meaning. Qin Shi Huang's early reforms sound almost modern. He abolished the feudal titles of the conquered states, dividing the empire into commanderies and counties run by appointed officials. He standardized weights, measures, and coinage. Even axle lengths of carts were made uniform so they'd fit the same ruts. He ordered roads, canals, and the first version of the Great Wall linking old frontier fortifications. But there was another standardization quietly building in the background, one far more dangerous: the standardization of thought itself. The Qin famously standardized writing, promoting the small seal script as the official form. That itself was not censorship, it was administrative. But once you have a fixed way to write, the next question becomes, what are you allowed to write? The empire was full of scholars, many trained under rival states, steeped in traditions that painted wise kings as those who limited power, listened to remonstrance, and revered ancient texts. To Qin Shi Huang and his ministers, these scholars looked less like guardians of wisdom and more like ideological time bombs. The official records of the Grand Historian, written by Sima Qian a century later, describes an atmosphere of tension. Scholars at court reportedly criticized Qin policies, invoking the ancient sage kings Yao, Shun, and the Zhou founders. The implied message was obvious: you, emperor, fall short. For a legalist state obsessed with unity, this kind of moral comparison was subversive. But that wasn't the only problem. Old aristocratic families and rival traditions still commanded loyalty. Ideas weren't just abstract, they were networks of power. Qin's rulers wanted one network, their own. In 213 BCE, according to Sima Qian, Qin's chancellor Li Si submitted a memorial that would become infamous. He argued that the empire was newly unified and fragile, yet private teachings from the past were undermining it. Scholars, he claimed, used the ancient odes and documents to criticize present policies, spreading doubt among officials and commoners. Different schools, Confucians, Mohists, others, argued endlessly, confusing the people. If Qin didn't control learning, Li Si warned, factional chaos would return. His solution was drastic. Li Si proposed banning most private possession of historical and philosophical texts. Only the Qin's own official history of the state would be preserved in government archives. Books from the 6 states that denigrated Qin should be destroyed. Non-technical writings on poetry, history, and philosophy, especially those Confucian classics, were to be handed over or burned. Yet there was a revealing exception. Works on medicine, divination, agriculture, and other practical arts could stay. The state didn't fear knowledge itself. It feared alternative moral and political narratives. Qin Shi Huang reportedly approved Li Si's proposal. The decree went out. Within 30 days, private individuals had to surrender forbidden books to officials for burning. Those who dared to keep them would face punishment, forced labor on the Great Wall or in distant frontier projects. For many families, these scrolls weren't just reading material. They were heirlooms, repositories of lineage, proof of cultural status. Now, under the new empire, they became contraband. Overnight, the authority of the past was legally subordinated to the authority of the first emperor. So did ancient China really watch its libraries go up in smoke? Archaeology complicates the picture. Qin didn't have central libraries like later dynasties. Texts were mostly held by aristocratic families and scholars. The burning was likely decentralized. Bundles of bamboo slips seized and destroyed across the empire, especially in former rival capitals. Some texts survived buried, hidden, or transmitted orally, but symbolically, the impact was huge. For the first time, a Chinese state wasn't just punishing seditious speech, it was trying to preempt entire categories of thought. Not everyone complied. Later stories tell of scholars secretly memorizing entire classics, or hiding scrolls in walls and underfloors. Some of this is probably romanticized, shaped by later Han Dynasty admiration for Confucian heroes. But we do know that many transmitted texts in later centuries show signs of damage, loss, and reconstruction, suggesting some textual traditions were indeed interrupted. The Qin crackdown didn't erase ideas. It fractured their lineages, creating gaps, variants, and debates that scholars would argue over for centuries. The decree didn't stop at burning pages. It targeted people. Sima Qian writes that those who continued to discuss the odes and documents or criticized Qin's present, with reference to the past, would be punished harshly. Tattooed, their noses cut off, and sent to forced labor. The same fate awaited officials who failed to report dissent. In short, thought crimes became legal crimes. You could still think privately. No one could reach into your head. But once your thoughts found words, the state's machinery could crush you. Meanwhile, Qin Shi Huang toured his empire in grand inspection journeys. He visited the eastern seas, climbed sacred mountains, and erected stone inscriptions praising his own achievements. These steles carefully avoided praising ancient kings. Instead, they emphasized that the first emperor had broken with the past to create something entirely new. The ideology was clear. History wasn't a judge above the emperor. History started with him. The book-burning decree was just the legal counterpart of this attitude. But soon, another darker story would attach to his name. You've probably heard the story. Qin Shi Huang not only burned books, he buried hundreds of scholars alive. It's one of the most chilling images in Chinese historical memory. According to Sima Qian, in 212 BCE, a court astrologer named Chunyu Yue criticized the emperor indirectly, predicting disaster and urging him to reform. Other scholars spoke similarly. When Qin Shi Huang found out, he was furious. He ordered an investigation. Li Si led interrogations that uncovered a supposed network of slanderers. The punishment would become legendary. Sima Qian reports that over 460 scholars, learned men, were condemned. Their crime? Criticizing the emperor and violating the book ban. Their punishment? Execution, allegedly by being buried alive in the capital, Xianyang. It's a scene so stark it's etched into Chinese idioms. Burning books and burying scholars. Fenshu Keng Rus. But historians today debate details. Were they actually buried alive or executed then buried? Did 460 mean a rounded figure? And most crucially, were they really Confucian scholars or something else? The Han Dynasty, which replaced Qin, had every reason to vilify its predecessor. Han emperors promoted Confucianism as state orthodoxy and cast Qin as the negative example, harsh, short-lived, and unhuman. Sima Qian wrote under Han rule. Some modern scholars argue the victims in 212 BCE were primarily court diviners and alchemists, not classical scholars. The Shiji itself calls them Fangshi, masters of esoteric arts, who had promised Qin Shi Huang immortality and failed. Their execution, then, might have been less ideological purging and more rage at broken promises. Qin Shi Huang was obsessed with immortality. As he aged, he dispatched expeditions eastward, like the mission led by Shu Fu, to seek mythical islands of immortals. He consumed elixirs containing mercury and other substances that likely harmed his health. Court alchemists and diviners promised him extended life. When these quests failed, frustration grew. The Shiji hints that the 212 BCE executions targeted those who had deceived the emperor with false arts and then slandered him. Still, later memory compressed everything. The book burning, the scholar killings, into one terrifying image: an emperor at war with thinkers. So what did Qin actually preserve? Legal codes, administrative regulations, and the Qin state's own history. The regime didn't want a blank slate. It wanted a curated one. Official scribes recorded decrees, population registers, land allocations, and punishments. In recent decades, excavations of Qin and early Han tombs have yielded bamboo slips with legal texts strikingly similar to those described in the Shiji. They confirm a ruthless but sophisticated bureaucracy. Ironically, the things Qin cared about most, laws and records, are what archaeology recovers best. The lost arguments are harder to reconstruct. Discoveries at sites like Shuihudi in Hubei and Liye in Hunan have unearthed troves of Qin bamboo slips. They include law codes, case records, administrative instructions, even mundane notes about corvée labor. These finds show us a Qin world highly organized, concerned with uniform enforcement, and deeply intrusive in daily life. But philosophical texts? Far rarer. That may reflect Qin's priorities, or later losses. Still, the very survival of these slips tells us something uncomfortable. The system of control Qin built was real, detailed, and, for a time, frighteningly effective. Punished thinkers didn't always vanish into pits. Many became numbers in labor gangs. Qin conscripted huge numbers of commoners and convicts to build roads, canals, palaces, and frontier walls. Some scholars who defied the book decree were reportedly sent to labor on projects like the Apang Palace or the great fortifications in the north. For an educated elite used to wielding words as power, being turned into anonymous labor was its own form of erasure. Body alive, voice silenced. Yet even this machinery of fear couldn't secure what Qin Shi Huang wanted most: permanence. While he tried to control minds in life, Qin Shi Huang prepared for control in death. Near modern Xi'an, he ordered the construction of an enormous mausoleum, begun soon after he took the throne. The famous terracotta army, thousands of life-sized soldiers, horses and chariots, was part of this vast funereal complex. According to Sima Qian, rivers of mercury flowed within, simulating seas. Craftsmen created a miniature empire underground. Here, beneath the earth, the first emperor would rule forever, in a world he had fully scripted. No dissenting texts, no critical scholars. But above ground, reality refused to obey the script. In 210 BCE, while on an inspection tour, Qin Shi Huang died, likely from illness, perhaps worsened by the very elixirs meant to prolong his life. His death was initially concealed by his close advisors, including Li Si and the eunuch Zhao Gao, as they maneuvered to control succession. The chosen heir, Fusu, who had previously remonstrated with his father, was forced to commit suicide. A weaker son, Huhai, became second emperor. Within 2 years, the empire began to unravel. In 209 BCE, 2 low-ranking officers, Chen Sheng and Wu Guang, led a mutiny after storms delayed their troops, making them legally punishable under Qin's unforgiving laws. Facing death either way, they turned their desperation into rebellion. Peasants, displaced nobles, and former soldiers rallied to anti-Qin causes across the empire. Qin's own tools, harsh punishments, centralized control, backfired spectacularly. When fear is the only glue holding a system together, what happens when that fear cracks? The empire that tried to erase the past was now racing toward becoming a cautionary tale. By 207 BCE, rebel leaders like Xiang Yu and Liu Bang had shattered Qin's defenses. The last Qin ruler, the hapless Xing, surrendered. Xianyang fell. Xiang Yu's forces reportedly burned the palaces, including the vast Epang Palace, for months. Whatever Qin archives existed, they likely suffered catastrophic loss. The regime that tried to control memory couldn't even save its own. Ironically, much of what we know about Qin doesn't come from Qin's voice at all, but from the texts of its successors, some of whom hated everything it stood for. Liu Bang, a former low-ranking official, emerged victorious in the power struggle after Qin's fall, founding the Han dynasty in 202 BCE as Emperor Gaozu. Early Han rulers learned from Qin's failures. They eased punishments, reduced corvée labor, and gradually elevated Confucian scholars as moral guides of the state. Yet they kept much of Qin's bureaucratic structure: commanderies, standardized laws, and centralized authority. In public, Qin was denounced as a brutal aberration. In practice, its administrative skeleton became the backbone of imperial China for centuries. Under Emperor Wu of Han, in the 2nd century BCE, Confucianism was promoted as the official ideology. Classics like the Book of Documents, Book of Odes, and Spring and Autumn Annals were canonized. Scholars who had preserved or reconstructed these texts gained status. The story of Qin's book burning became a powerful origin myth. The virtuous classics, nearly lost to a tyrant, heroically recovered. This narrative wasn't neutral history, it was ideological weaponry, just as much as Qin's earlier decrees had been. History, once again, was being edited. Our main window into Qin's censorship comes from one man, Sima Qian, the grand historian of Han. Writing around 100 BCE, he composed the Shiji, Records of the Grand Historian, covering Chinese history from legendary times to his present. Sima Qian admired Confucian virtues and served a dynasty that defined itself against Qin. He also personally suffered castration after defending a disgraced general, which may have sharpened his sensitivity to state cruelty. His accounts of Qin's book burning and scholar executions are detailed and devastating. But can we take them at face value? Modern scholarship cross-examines Sima Qian. Some parts of his Qin narrative are corroborated by archaeological finds, like aspects of Qin law. Others, especially dramatic numbers and motives, are harder to verify. The burning of books decree, for instance, fits legalist logic and broader Qin policies, making it plausible. Yet the image of all non-Qin literature going up in flames is clearly exaggerated. Many pre-Qin texts survived in some form. The scholar executions likely happened, but their framing as a war on Confucianism specifically may be more Han-era storytelling than Qin reality. Take the Book of Documents, Shujing. Some chapters show linguistic features suggesting pre-Qin origins. Others appear to be later compositions or heavily edited. Han scholars themselves distinguished between ancient script and modern script versions. The Qin book burning may have destroyed many copies, forcing later generations to reconstruct texts from memory or scattered fragments. In that reconstruction, new material could enter. Censorship, paradoxically, didn't just erase, it also distorted, creating a mixture of survival and reinvention that makes it harder to know exactly what pre-Qin thought looked like. Han Confucians portrayed themselves as saviors of the past, rescuing true tradition from Qin's flames. Yet they too shaped that tradition. Commentaries reinterpreted classic texts to fit Han imperial needs. Stories of Qin's atrocities were amplified to justify Han policies and the moral authority of Confucians. The phrase burning books and burying scholars became shorthand for ultimate tyranny. Over time, Qin Shi Huang was less a specific historical figure and more a symbol, the ruler who tried to delete history and silence scholars, and whose empire paid the price. But here's where Qin's story becomes uncomfortably familiar. Later Chinese dynasties, including the supposedly more benevolent Han, also censored texts, banned perverse writings, and punished critics. The Qing dynasty compiled massive imperial encyclopedias while simultaneously conducting literary inquisitions against authors deemed disloyal. Outside China, rulers from the Roman emperors to the Catholic Church to modern totalitarian regimes have tried to control what people can read and say. Qin's experiment wasn't unique. It was just one of the earliest and most vividly remembered attempts at total thought control. So what does total thought control really mean? Qin couldn't literally read minds, but it tried to shape minds before they formed. By destroying alternative histories, it aimed to remove the standards by which rulers could be judged. By criminalizing discussions of certain texts, it tried to break the habit of using the past as a mirror. By rewarding compliant officials and punishing critics, it sought to rewire elite incentives. The goal was not just obedience, but a world where other ways of thinking became unthinkable. We don't know much about education under Qin at the village level, but at the court, the direction is clear. Scholars were to study law and administration, not moral philosophy from rival schools. If future officials were trained only in the state's own texts, then over generations the intellectual landscape would narrow. Imagine growing up never hearing about alternative systems of ethics, never reading stories where rulers are judged and sometimes overthrown by moral standards. That was the horizon Qin's policies pointed toward had the dynasty lasted. The pattern of what Qin banned versus what it allowed is revealing. Works on farming, medicine, and divination were fine. They helped the state's practical needs. What it targeted were narratives, especially those in which the past judged the present, or in which sages outside the current regime defined what was right. In effect, Qin tried to keep knowledge that increased its control, while erasing knowledge that limited its legitimacy. That distinction between useful and dangerous knowledge echoes eerily in later systems of control, from inquisitions to firewalls. Another part of Li Si's proposal was social. He wanted mutual surveillance. Officials were ordered to report critics. Those who concealed dissenters would be punished like the offenders. This weaponized fear and distrust within the educated class. Censorship wasn't just about burning objects. It was about reshaping relationships so that open criticism became dangerous, not only because of the state, but because of peers. Once that dynamic takes hold, many people censor themselves. You don't need to burn every book when readers are afraid to open them. Yet even at its height, Qin's control had limits. The empire was huge. Local magistrates varied in zeal and competence. Some likely enforced the book decree aggressively. Others looked the other way. Remote estates and family archives could hide texts beyond immediate reach. Oral tradition, stories, songs, sayings, preserved ideas the state never fully captured. And most of all, Qin didn't last long enough. It collapsed after just 15 years as an empire. Thought control is a long game. Qin tried to sprint through something that, by nature, takes generations. After Qin's fall, stories spread of hidden classics being recovered. Some texts were supposedly found in walls of houses, most famously the Old Script, book of documents said to be discovered in the Kong family home, descendants of Confucius. Whether every discovery happened exactly as told is debatable. But the symbolism mattered. What Qin tried to bury, Han would revive. The act of recovery itself became sacred. Scholars weren't just reading books. They were resurrecting a moral universe that a tyrant had tried, and failed, to annihilate. Han emperors sponsored massive projects to collect, collate, and standardize classic texts. Court conferences debated correct versions. Official editions were engraved on stone. The message was as political as Qin's decrees. This state embraces history, listens to sages, and roots its authority in continuity, not rupture. Yet by choosing which texts to canonize and how to interpret them, Han also exercised control. The difference from Qin was method, not the basic impulse. Instead of burning rival texts, Han marginalized them through prestige and institutional power. Qin's story is also the story of clashing philosophies. Confucius, centuries earlier, had emphasized learning from the Zhou dynasty's rituals and documents. Mozi criticized hereditary privilege and extravagant warfare. Laozi, whether historical or composite, was associated with skepticism about rigid institutions. Han Fei, a prince of the rival state of Han, synthesized legalist ideas into a chilling manual of power. Li Si, once Han Fei's fellow student, adapted those ideas in Qin. Qin Shi Huang didn't invent the desire to control minds. He found a toolkit waiting for him in legalist thought. Han Fei and Li Si reportedly studied together under the philosopher Xunzi, a Confucian with a harder, more realistic edge. Xunzi believed human nature was bad and required strong institutions and ritual to reform it. Han Fei drew from this a dark legalism. Li Si followed similar paths, yet their teacher still valued the classics and moral discourse. His students stripped those away. When Li Si later argued for burning books, he was effectively rejecting part of his own intellectual lineage. That tension between moral tradition and raw control runs through this entire story. Legalism and Confucianism weren't just rival theories. They offered different answers to the same question. How do you keep order in a large state? Legalists said, clear laws, severe punishments, absolute rulership, suspicion of tradition. Confucians said, virtuous rulers, moral education, ritual continuity, respect for history. Qin chose one side decisively. Han publicly chose the other, but privately blended both, maintaining many legalist mechanisms. The book-burning episode sits at this crossroads, as a moment when one ideology tried to wipe institutional memory of its competitors off the map. Did Qin's policies work? In the short term, yes. They stifled open dissent, unified administration, and mobilized immense resources. The empire could coordinate massive projects and maintain relative internal peace for a while. But success came at a cost. Loyalty based on fear is brittle. When crises hit, succession disputes, harvest problems, overextension, there was no deep reservoir of shared legitimacy to draw on. The same machinery that suppressed criticism also suppressed honest feedback. Problems festered unreported. By trying to eliminate alternative voices, Qin eliminated early warning systems. Imagine being Qin Shi Huang near the end of his life. He had unified the realm, standardized its systems, crushed rivals, and silenced critics. Official inscriptions proclaimed that his virtue surpassed ancient kings and would be celebrated for 10,000 generations. Yet he was haunted by death, chasing immortality, and increasingly isolated from honest counsel. In his effort to control reality, he built walls around his own mind. When his body finally failed, the empire he'd remade in his own image had nothing solid to stand on, and collapsed almost immediately. Qin's attempt to edit reality wasn't the last. Roman emperors ordered damning of memory. Medieval authorities banned heretical texts. In the 20th century, regimes staged public book burnings and controlled publishing. Today, censorship can be algorithmic, quietly hiding content rather than burning it. The technologies differ, but the logic, control the narratives, control the present, remains eerily constant. Studying Qin Shi Huang isn't just about ancient China. It's about recognizing recurring patterns whenever power meets information. The tools have evolved. The temptations haven't. Consider Li Si's core argument. Multiple schools of thought confuse the people and destabilize the state. Therefore, one orthodoxy must dominate. Swap bamboo slips for feeds, and you hear similar debates today about information overload, fake news, and the need for curated truth. Of course, modern contexts are wildly different, but the underlying question, who gets to decide which ideas are legitimate, is still with us. Qin's experiment shows both the seductive promise of enforced unity and its catastrophic fragility when imposed from above. Despite everything, many voices Qin tried to silence, or that Han later claimed it tried to silence, still speak to us. The Analects of Confucius, the writings of Mencius, parts of Mozi, Zhuangzi's wild Taoist tales, all survived, sometimes in damaged forms, sometimes through contested transmission. Their survival undercuts the myth of total control. No regime, however ruthless, has yet achieved complete erasure of unwanted ideas. They persist in hidden copies, in memory, in reinterpretation. Often, the very attempt to destroy them makes them more famous later. It's easy to reduce Qin to a caricature of tyranny, But millions of ordinary people lived their lives under its rule. Farmers planted, craftsmen worked, merchants traded. Many may have welcomed the end of constant interstate warfare. The book-burning decree, while shocking to us, might have barely touched the vast illiterate population. Thought control at Qin's level targeted elites, those who read, taught, and advised. But by shaping the education of that elite, the regime tried to shape the framework through which everyone else's world was administered. Here's a quiet form of resistance: memory outside the written word. While Qin targeted books and scholars, oral tradition likely continued. Elders told stories of the old states, of virtuous and wicked rulers, of times before Qin. Such tales could subtly question imperial propaganda without ever citing banned texts. Censorship focused on scrolls and formal teachings. Everyday talk is harder to police. This gap between official reality and lived memory is where many societies hide their unsanctioned histories, waiting for a safer time to be written down. Qin didn't entirely ban discussing the past. It banned using the past to criticize the present. That nuance matters. You could reference history to praise the emperor or justify his policies. You just couldn't draw unflattering comparisons. This conditional tolerance is a common thread in censored societies. History is allowed as long as it serves current power. Once it becomes a tool of critique, it's labeled dangerous. Qin's particular innovation was to write that boundary explicitly into law and to attach terrifying penalties to crossing it. There's a deep irony here. Qin tried to erase or subordinate Confucian texts and scholars. Yet under Han and later dynasties, Confucianism became the official ideology of the very imperial systems that inherited Qin's administrative framework. Imperial exams tested knowledge of classics. Officials justified policies with Confucian language. In a way, the moral universe Qin tried to suppress ended up governing the empire built on Qin's foundations. Thought control can delay an idea's influence. Sometimes it even shapes the context in which that idea will later triumph. Even the architect of Qin's thought control couldn't escape its logic. After Qin Shi Huang's death, Li Si was embroiled in palace struggles. The eunuch Zhao Gao manipulated the second emperor, turning him against Li Si. Accused of treason, Li Si was executed, according to tradition, by the gruesome 5 pains. The man who had urged the emperor to criminalize dissent now found himself crushed by a system of fear he'd helped create. His fate is a reminder. In regimes built on suspicion, today's enforcer is often tomorrow's victim. So how much did Qin's book burning actually destroy? We'll never know precisely. Some works vanished completely. Others survived only in fragments or quotations. Yet the broad contours of pre-Qin thought, Confucian, Mohist, Taoist, legalist, are still visible. In that sense, Qin failed at its grandest goal. It altered the transmission of texts but could not erase the diversity of ideas. And by becoming the villain in later narratives, it unintentionally elevated the very voices it tried to silence, turning them into moral benchmarks for all future rulers. Editing reality is a temptation that crosses cultures and centuries. From imperial chronicles that omit embarrassing defeats to modern regimes rewriting textbooks, power often tries to tell a story about itself. Clean, heroic, unquestioned. Qin Shi Huang was one of the first to attempt this at imperial scale, backed by law and violence. His failure doesn't mean future attempts always fail. It means they leave traces, gaps, silences, oddly shaped archives. Learning to read those absences is part of understanding any history, including our own. Today, philologists reconstruct ancient texts by comparing versions, noting where chapters appear or vanish, where wording shifts. Qin's censorship is one factor, among many, in these textual puzzles. Some missing sections may be due to loss, neglect, or later editing, not deliberate burning. But knowing that one powerful regime tried to narrow the canon forces us to ask, what voices are we missing because they were specifically targeted? That question applies not just to ancient China, but to any tradition where power and writing have been entangled. One of Confucianism's core ideas is that history is a mirror. By studying past successes and failures, rulers can govern better. Qin tried to smash that mirror and replace it with its own reflection. Han put the mirror back, but polished it to reflect Han's own ideals. Every society does some version of this, choosing which pasts to emphasize. The value of Qin's dark example is that it makes the manipulation obvious. Once you've seen such extreme editing, subtler edits elsewhere become easier to notice and to question. Historical truth is rarely preserved in a single untouched text. It emerges from comparing sources, recognizing bias, and understanding context. With Qin, we have hostile narratives from Han, silent ruins from Xianyang, scattered legal slips, and later philosophical traditions. Each tells part of the story. Recognizing Sima Qian's perspective doesn't mean dismissing him. It means reading him critically, seeing both how he exposed Qin's brutality and how his own era's needs shaped that exposure. In doing so, we resist becoming passive consumers of any curated reality. Stand again before the terracotta army. Thousands of faces, each slightly different, frozen in formation. They were meant to guard an emperor who tried to command not just bodies and land, but memory and meaning. Yet today, those statues attract millions who come to learn about a history he partly tried to erase. The mausoleum that was supposed to seal his story has instead reopened it. Archaeology, like a stubborn counterscript, keeps adding footnotes Qin never approved. The dead, it turns out, don't sign off on final drafts. Our understanding of Qin, and of its censorship, will keep changing. New excavations might uncover private libraries, legal documents, or even Qin versions of texts we thought were purely Han. Each find can shift the balance, confirming Sima Qian here, questioning him there. History is not a static verdict, it's an ongoing investigation. Qin Shi Huang wanted the last word on the past. Instead, he became an open case file, revisited by each generation. In that sense, the ultimate refusal of thought control is simply this: we keep asking questions. When you walk into a library today, you are walking into the opposite of what Qin tried to build, a space where many voices coexist, contradict, and challenge each other. That pluralism is messy, it can feel chaotic. But it's also a defense against any single power deciding which memories are allowed. The story of Qin's book burning isn't just something that happened long ago. It's a warning label attached to any attempt, ancient or modern, to tidy up reality by deleting the inconvenient parts. In the end, Qin Shi Huang achieved one kind of immortality, not the kind he sought. His body lies in a still unopened tomb, surrounded by engineered rivers and armies of clay. His laws are long gone, his decrees turned to dust. But his attempt to control thought became a case study for all future ages. A spectacular, short-lived experiment in editing reality from above. And reality, slowly but decisively, edited him back out. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the unknown, subscribe for more uninteresting history.